You're learning with 9 to 5 English. Business English for the workplace. Hi, Tim here with another 9 to 5 English lesson. In today's lesson, we're going to learn how to talk about where you are from. In the world of business, we have the chance to meet people from all sorts of backgrounds. And one of the most common questions we ask people we've just met is, "Where are you from?" In other words, where do you come from? So, how do you answer that question? Well, we can understand it in two ways. First, it might mean where you grew up. That is, where you lived as a child. One way you can talk about where you grew up is to say you were raised or were born in a certain place. And that place might be a country, a city, or an area of the world. If someone asks where you're from, you can also just use that word, from, in your answer. Like, I'm from France. And if you grew up in France, but you don't live there now, you might say, I'm originally from France. Also, if you're talking about which country you're from, you could just say your nationality, such as, I'm French. How about practicing some of this language? We're going to give you some examples. After you hear each example, try repeating it yourself. Ready? Let's give it a go.
I was raised in a small town in Ohio.
I'm Irish, born and bred.
I'm originally from Santiago.
I was born in Spain, but now I live in France.
We've just practiced some ways of talking about where you grew up. In other words, these are ways to talk about where you are originally from. That's the first meaning of, where are you from? But the second meaning of this question is, where do you live now? After all, in the 21st century, many people don't live and work in the same place they grew up. One way to answer the question is simply to say, I live and work in such and such a place. That's a clear and direct answer. You might also say, I've got a place in a certain city. A place, in this case, means a home, as in a house or an apartment. So, for example, you might say, I've got a little place in London. That idea of home can also be used in an answer. You can say that you call a certain place home. For example, when someone asks where you're from, and they mean where you currently live, you can say, I call London home. That expression lets people know that you haven't always lived there, but you do now. In this situation, you might even let people know how long you've lived in that place. For example, you might say, I've been in London for the past 5 years. Now it's your turn to try using these expressions. You'll hear some examples. After each example, repeat what you hear. Let's begin.
I live and work just outside of London.
I've got a place in downtown San Diego.
These days I call Seattle home.
I've been in Berlin for the past 10 years or so.
So, as we've seen, the question, "Where are you from?" can be answered in two ways. It might mean, "Where did you grow up?" Or it might mean, "Where do you live now?" Usually, you can understand from the situation what someone means when they ask that question. And sometimes, people want to know both where you grew up and where you live. Okay, we've done a bit of practice with some useful expressions, but how does this sound in a conversation? Let's listen to a short discussion between Dave and Julie to find out.
So, are you originally from New York?
No, I was actually raised in a small town near Chicago.
Interesting. But now you call New York home?
That's right. I've got a place in Queens.
Can you see how that worked? Dave first wants to know where Julie grew up, which she explains with the expression, "I was raised in a place." Then he wants to know where she lives, and she says she's got a place in a certain part of New York. Now it's your turn to practice. We'll repeat the dialogue, but this time we're going to beep out Julie's words. You will have to say those parts yourself. Remember, first you'll say, "You were raised near Chicago." Then you'll say, "You've got a place in Queens." Here we go.
So, are you originally from New York? Interesting. But now you call New York home?
All right. So we've learned a few different ways to talk about where you're from. That includes where you grew up and where you live now. In our next lesson, we'll learn how to talk about your educational background. Until then, so long and happy learning. You're learning with 9 to 5 English. Business English for the workplace. Hi, Tim here with another 9 to 5 English lesson. In today's lesson, we are going to have a look at how to talk about your family. In business and in life, everything is about relationships. And to build relationships, we often talk about our background and our personal life. Of course, you can't get too personal, but family is a topic that everyone loves to discuss. For most people, family is the reason they work so hard in the first place. And believe me, if you ask someone about their family, they'll feel good. Better yet, if you remember what they've told you about their family, they'll feel great. And if you show interest in someone's family, they'll probably show interest in yours. So how can you answer questions about your family? Well, children are always an interesting subject. If you've got kids, you'll surely understand. So, you can simply say, how many children you have. You don't have to give too much detail, but you could mention whether they're boys or girls and how old they are. Or you might just say, 2 young children, or a teenaged son. Now, if you don't have children, you might just mention your spouse, which means your husband or wife. Or you might want to keep it really general. I mean, you could say something like, I come from a big family. And you might add something about where you're from or where you live. In this way, you're giving people an idea of who you are. How about a bit of practice talking about your family in these ways? We're going to give you some examples. After you hear each example, try repeating it yourself. Ready? Let's give it a go.
My wife and I have 2 boys aged 16 and 18.
Well, it's just my husband and I here in the States.
I've got a big family back in Edinburgh.
We've got 2 young children and a 3rd one on the way.
So when people ask an open-ended question about your family, they're probably wondering about your immediate family. That means your husband or wife and your kids. People don't want to know about your distant cousins. But people might ask about your parents or your family background. What exactly do you think people might want to know? Well, your parents' jobs may be interesting. So you could say something like, my father is a doctor and my mother is a teacher. If that sounds a bit boring, then how about mentioning some special accomplishment? Like, my mother invented a new type of car tire. Okay, maybe your mother didn't invent a tire, but it's just an example of interesting family history. And besides special accomplishments, sometimes in your family history, a particular job is common through different generations. In that case, you can say you come from a long line of engineers, for example, or a long line of salespeople, or whatever job it is that runs in your family. Now, what if the family has a business? Well, you can tell people what type of business, and you could even mention how long your family has run that business. These kinds of details about family, especially their jobs or business, are interesting to people. And they might also make you look good. I mean, if your family has been successful in business, people will naturally think that you've got talent too. Now, it's your turn to try using these expressions. Just like before, you'll hear some examples. After each example, you can repeat what you hear. Let's begin.
My dad is an engineer and my mom is in education.
I come from a long line of military folks.
My father worked at the first VW plant in Mexico.
Our family has run a clothing store for 3 generations.
So, Did you hear how that worked? There were some interesting details in those examples, right? And notice that we say run a business, which just means to operate a business. Now that we've practiced some of these expressions, let's hear how this sounds in an actual conversation. We're going to listen to Anne asking John about his family. And John is going to talk about his children and his family in the U.S.
So, is it just you and your wife here in Paris?
No, we've got our son and a daughter with us.
Oh, that must be nice. But I imagine you miss your family back home.
I sure do. I've got a pretty big family back in the States.
How did that sound? John mentioned his son and daughter and his big family back in the States. We can use that expression, back in, to talk about the place we originally come from. Now, it's your turn to practice. We'll repeat the dialogue, but this time we're going to beep out John's words. You will have to say those parts yourself. Remember, first you'll mention your kids, then you'll say that you have a big family in the U.S. Here we go.
So, is it just you and your wife here in Paris? Oh, that must be nice. But I imagine you miss your family back home.
Okay, so that's all for this lesson. We've had a look at both talking about your immediate family and talking about your parents or family background. And that wraps up our series of lessons on talking about your background. By now, you should be comfortable telling people about where you're from, your education, your career, and your family. Until our next lesson, so long and happy learning. You're learning with 9 to 5 English. Business English for the workplace. Hi, Tim here, with another 9 to 5 English lesson. In today's lesson, we're going to learn how to talk about your education. Your education is an important part of your background, and there are lots of situations where you might talk about where you went to school and what you studied. A job interview is an obvious one, but you might also talk about your education in casual conversation. The first thing you might mention is where you went to school. More specifically, people might be interested in which university you attended, and there are several ways we can tell them about that. Firstly, you might just use that verb, attend. Similarly, you could say you went to or graduated from a certain university. Another way to talk about your university is to say that you're an alum of a certain school. Alum is short for alumnus, which is a word that means a person who attended a school. So, for example, I might say, I'm an alum of Columbia University. Let's try practicing some of this language. We're going to give you some examples. After each example, try repeating it yourself. Ready? Let's give it a go.
I graduated from Yale in 2008.
For my undergrad, I went to the London School of Economics.
I attended a small technical college in Colorado.
I'm an alum of Washington University.
Okay, we've practiced some different ways of talking about our university. But another important aspect of your education is what you studied. In English, we call your area of study your major. This word can be used in a few different ways. So, for example, if you studied biology, you could say that your major was biology. But you can also say that you were a biology major. So the noun means both an area of study and a person who studies that area. We can also use major as a verb, such as, I majored in biology. After you tell someone your major, you might also mention an area of focus. For example, within business, you might have focused on finance. Or you might mention your minor, which is like your secondary area of study. And just as we say we majored in a subject, we can say we minored in a subject. There's another, much simpler way to talk about your major, and that's just to say something like, I studied biology. Of course, that's not the only course you took, but people understand that was your major. Now, there's one more way to tell people what you studied, and that's by saying you have a degree in a certain field. Your degree might be a master's degree or a bachelor's degree. And you can use the short form of these, such as an M.A. or a B.S., which means Bachelor's of Science and is used for degrees in technical fields, such as engineering or computers. Let's practice some of these expressions for talking about your major. Once again, you can repeat the examples after you hear them.
I studied international business with a focus on finance.
I majored in French with a minor in political science.
I started out as a science major, but switched to education.
I have a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering.
So, we've learned some different ways of talking about your university and your major. But how do these expressions sound in a real conversation? Let's listen to a short dialogue between Tanya and Jose. Tanya is asking Jose about his education.
So, did you go to university around here?
Yeah, I graduated from Iowa State University in 2010.
Oh, yeah? Great school. What did you study?
I majored in business with a minor in statistics.
As you just heard, Jose says he graduated from Iowa State University. And when asked about what he studied, he says he majored in business. He also adds that he had a minor in statistics. Now it's your turn to practice. We'll repeat the dialogue, but this time we'll beep out the second speaker's words. You will have to say those parts yourself. Remember to start by saying that you graduated from Iowa State University. Then you can say that you majored in business and minored in statistics.
So, did you go to university around here? Oh, yeah? Great school. What did you study?
All right. We've learned some great ways to talk about your education, including what university you attended and what you studied. Be sure to tune in next time when we'll learn how to talk about your career. Until then, so long and happy learning.